Ben, lovely to talk to you today. We are chatting about the Maths Standard exam. Help us or help the students watching get into the mindset of the exam. When is it? What can they expect on the day? Talk us through the structure of the exam.
Definitely. So we have the maths exams, the bulk of them, in that second week of exams. We normally kick off with English as we are this year. And then maths is on the 22nd of October, which is a Wednesday. It kicks off at about 9:20 in the morning. It's a 2.5 hour exam, which is a little bit different to a couple of the other courses. And we're built of a paper that's 100 marks. 15 of those, the first 15 in section 1, are multiple choice questions, followed by 85 marks of short answer, mixed extended response type questions that are anywhere from a couple of marks all the way up to sort of your bigger 6 or 7, 8 mark questions that might be scaffolded into a few parts.
Do the bigger questions tend to come towards the end of the exam? Is that a general trend? Like students should be kind of ready to start easier and progressively get harder? Is that how the exam's designed?
Look, standard is a little bit of a mixed bag, and it depends on the individual, really. Sometimes you can sort of predict that the difficulty level is going to scale up, and as a guide, you would normally think that it's going to start a little bit more routine and then end up a little bit more complicated. But there's definitely some curly ones that throw themselves in there early on as well, and sometimes some of the last questions are just layered versions of something that's quite straightforward and reasonable as well. But look, what you can typically expect in those first few written questions is a little bit as you're describing there. The things that are a little bit more skill repetition, a little bit more predictable. What Ness has done the past few years is they've actually kind of had an informal cutoff point after about 40, the low 40s number of marks. It's been after 44, 43, and 41 marks each of the past 3 years. So that's kind of like a bit of a line in the sand for me to say we're now switching from maybe the little bit more routine part of the paper into the little bit more involved part of the paper. So those first, if we were to use low 40s number of marks in section 2, are the types of things where you've hopefully seen them before. There shouldn't be anything that's too, whoa, I have no idea what this question is possibly asking me to do, or it's tying together 2, 3, 4 different topics or ideas altogether. You're sort of thinking those first 40-ish marks in section 2 should be a little bit more routine.
Just while we're still on the structure of the exam, what are the implications for what you've just said in terms of like time management of questions? Like if you're thinking like, obviously it's starting off a little easier and scaffolding students into it, and it's likely to pick up some point halfway through the mark
Yeah.
allocation. Does that mean students should be a bit more conscious of their time earlier in the exam and not getting too stuck on those early questions to make sure they've got time for what might be trickier questions later in the exam?
Definitely. Look, NESA's guide that they have on the front cover of the examination is going to be 25 minutes for the multiple choice questions, and then the remainder of your time to be able to be spent on section 2. I would be suggesting that those first 40 marks, 40-ish marks, I'd probably be thinking about an hour. Now, our time guide here as well, we've got 100 marks in this paper. We've got 2.5 hours or 150 minutes to be doing that. So we're talking about 1.5 minutes for every mark. Now, that doesn't have to be, I see a 2-mark question, I need to spend 3 minutes on that, or I could never spend more than 3 minutes of it. But if you use those first 40 marks as a guide and said, all right, again, if we went on the last few years, it's somewhere between 41 and 44 marks. If that's taking you about an hour, you have banked a little bit of time to attempt some of the harder stuff a little bit later on. But again, I would be adjusting that response depending on the type of student that you are and where you're placing your emphasis. If you're really trying to make sure that you bed down the marks that are routine because you know you struggle with worded problems and you know you struggle with some of the bigger mark questions, then maybe investing a little bit more time earlier in the paper and not rushing and pushing yourself could be a better idea. If you're somebody who's really pushing for the upper echelons of the band results, then maybe you should be really trying to be strict with, I need to bank some time so that I can spend a little bit more time later on for that 5 marker that's going to come, and I've got to actually construct a bit of a response and think about where I get in here and what I'm really being asked to do.
It's a long exam, as you said, 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
What's your advice generally to students about just like stamina and like energy through the exam? Because like students, as you said, like it's, about halfway, their energy and concentration is likely to wane slightly as well. So how do you kind of encourage your students to pace themselves for the long run?
Yeah, I would be suggesting a couple of things. One, that's got to inform how you practice as well. You've done a trial exam, and that might be the only point that you've done a really long maths exam. Even some Year 12 half yearly exams are only, I say only, but only 2 hours. You're an extra half an hour on top of that, and you're probably going to be landing on the most difficult stuff when you are the most tired and fatigued. So just like if I was training to run a marathon, I'm not going to go for a couple of 10K runs and then say, I hope I can extend this out to 4 times that length. In the same way, doing 30 or 60-minute practice sessions on exam questions and going, I hope I can sustain that for 2.5 hours is probably not a great idea either. So by all means, start shorter and build up to something longer. But actually, in the weeks leading up to the HSC exam block, sitting down and doing some full exams is not a bad idea. Sitting down and doing an exam like you are walking into the HSC, seeing a paper that you've never seen before and grappling through that time management, wrestling through, I don't know what to do with this question that looks like it should be simple. How do I approach that? Thinking about how we tackle some of those bigger mark questions and manage all those things. You've really got to have a go at it to actually do it well. So that would be my suggestion, that the only way you're learning how to manage that and have the stamina to do a 2.5 hour paper is by doing a couple of 2.5 hour papers. Now, please, don't try to do a 2.5 hour paper on Tuesday, the 21st of October, the day before you do the next one, or do something silly like do 5 hours of cramming exam prep the day before. That's just going to burn you a little bit. I'm talking about giving yourself a long lead in time and actually in those school holiday 2 or 3 weeks, depending on what your school's finishing dates are at the end of term 3, set yourself a structure and a time in there to say, that's a day where I will do a maths paper. I'm going to do one this Tuesday and then on the Friday, and I will do the entire paper and I will mark it and I will see what sort of mark I'm getting, see where my strengths and weaknesses lie and so on. But even just with the eye of, I want to do this like it's an exam.
Yeah, that's good advice. And with the holidays coming up, and you've kind of touched on it there, and then only a couple of weeks before the actual exams, is there anything outside of the practice exams that you would be suggesting students make part of a good kind of revision routine? Like is it just about balancing the study with a little bit of well-being? Is it about like the types of questions they're doing? Yeah, what's your kind of general advice for, practice routine?
Yeah. Look, I like, as a starting point, a bit of a traffic light system, red, yellow, green. Reds are the things that I know I'm not great at, whether that's something that I've found in my trial or it's something that I know I didn't quite wrap my head around when we did that 2 or 3 week topic at school, or I actually got some feedback on my end of Year 12 report that said you should go and revise trigonometry and financial mathematics, but these other things are an area of strength. Those would be my red lights. And I would actually probably want to put in some work before jumping into the exam questions with those things. That might be looking at a topic test or a progress check or something smaller that is just focused on a couple of smaller skills and things that are within that topic area, because that's going to give you the confidence, that's going to give you the foundation to actually build into the exam style questions. So that would maybe be my yellows, the things that, okay, I think I understand what to do, but I'm not necessarily executing perfectly right now. That might be the type of thing where I've actually got to do some more targeted questions and filter through some exams and say, right, here's 5 exam questions on networks. And I kind of get the ideas, but I need to execute a bit better. I find myself getting 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 5 when I know I should be doing better on those questions and practicing them that way. And then your green light questions would be the things where you say, I know I'm really good at this. For simple and routine problems, I can execute. I just need to do so accurately. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going and doing a chapter review from my textbook or a pretty basic progress check on those type of things. That's where I want to see the harder exam questions. That's the things I might leave until I do that full exam paper type setup. As you're doing so as well, don't neglect the things from year 11 because they can explicitly be asked in your exam. I would suggest a particular emphasis on the things from year 11 that aren't revisited in year 12. There's a few topics that don't come up in year 11 but do in year 12 and vice versa. Consider spending a bit of extra time on some of those ones. Probability would become one that comes to my mind. It gets hit in year 11, but not in year 12. Make sure that's part of your study routine.
It's really good advice because those might have been 6, 10 months since students have looked at that, right? So they might be like, whoa, like, so that advice of just revisiting and refreshing, have that front of mind.
Yeah, definitely. And they're the types of things where in some of those topics from year 11, you might not see 1 or 2 mark questions. That might be your 5 or 6 mark scaffolded questions.
Yeah, wow.
There is a lot of stuff to be across. I look, and I say with a particular emphasis on the things that are not recovered, only because we talk about linear relationships in year 11. We then talk about non-linear relationships and use linear relationships typically as a building block for that in year 12. We do some finance in year 11 and then readdress a lot of it in year 12. So some of that stuff that's covered in year 11, you will inherently, and your teachers will have done this with you, and you will have done this as part of your ongoing work and preparation. You will have seen those things and refreshed them a little bit. I'm sort of thinking the stuff that doesn't come up in both years that might need that extra little bit of attention. You might actually need to, as you say, put it front of mind and go, oh, I haven't seen that. I did that in May of year 11 and I'm about to sit an exam in October of the next year. That's a long time. So just making sure that you put yourself across that.
You've segued perfectly, Ben, to my next question, which is around the areas to focus on, the topics for students to look at. What are the big kind of areas that are usually examined or usually make an appearance that you'd be suggesting students look at, just to make sure they've got their bases covered?
Yeah, look, the types of things that come up in the first half of that paper, that sort of informal first half, if you'd like, that first 40-ish written marks. And looking through the last 3 years of exam papers, some things that I saw come up a number of times: BAC, blood alcohol concentration, earning money, reading and interpreting a graph, and then using those skills in some way. Things like rate conversions, the basic problems of networks, so both drawing a network, interpreting a network, finding a spanning tree, and that type of thing. Finance tables, something that have come up, I think, in each of the past 3 exams in some way, either interpreting one, filling one in. Those tend to pop up in that first half a little bit. And algebraic techniques and using formulae in some way, whether it be for a substitution or a rearrangement or solving something with it. Those are the types of things that sort of pop up in those first 40 marks. To my point, again, about year 11, a number of those things I've just mentioned are actually all from year 11 as well. So a good space for you to go and dust off that old textbook or again, access some of those resources that you've got available to make sure that you're across some of those things from the previous year as well.
For students, you talked about earlier, for students going for a band 6 or really wanting to stand out, what's your advice for students with that mindset? How should they be thinking about the topics or practice, or what is going to help them to really stand out? What are the skills or things that they need to be able to show in the exam usually?
Yeah, look, for that type of student that you're describing, those 40 marks, first 40 marks, really, you want to stay out of your own way. Now, perfection is a high bar to reach. I'm not suggesting that if the cutoff this year happens to be 43 marks and you know you've struck out on a couple of things, don't be hard on yourself. It's not all over. But really, if you're pushing for that top band result, you've got to be looking at the questions that sit in the latter half of that paper and thinking, what are the more challenging things that I'm looking at here? What are the questions that are tying together a few different ideas? And how do I unpack those? Each of the last 3 years, NESA has included a question that is sort of heavier in the marks without any scaffolding. The idea of seeing scaffolded questions with part A, part B, part C that are worth 2 marks or something along those lines, those are really routine. You'll see 10 of those in this exam or 12 of those in this exam in some way that are scaffolded. But NESA has been really clear, and have done so the last couple of years, that they're going to include a 4 or 5 mark question that has no scaffolding. That is essentially some information, typically some visuals as well, whether that be 1 or 2 different graphs to compare or a graph to add to, and then finish by unpacking something that's quite layered. There was a question a couple of years ago with a scatter plot where students had to make several comments about some of the trends they were seeing on that scatter plot. And it was intentionally quite ambiguous. There were lots of things you could say. It wasn't black and white. Okay, well, there's 5 things to say, and if you say 4 of them, you get get those marks. It was a little bit more open than that, where you could actually justify a lot of different things depending on how you presented that information. And how you interpreted it. And a similar one a couple of years before that, comparing some bivariate data with a box and whisker plot as well. So some of those statistics questions that tie together a lot of the work over the 2 years in statistics have popped up as those bigger mark questions. Often you'll end up seeing some things with some harder measurement as well, not necessarily really heavy on the marks, might only be a 2 or 3 marker, but some things where you really have to be able to visualize what type of problem you're dealing with and what type of skills you would need to solve that. Something that might involve a volume compared to an area or something of that nature, where they're bigger marks and bigger content as well, heavier content for students to unpack. If I'm a student looking for a band 6, I know that I'm going to have to tackle some questions that are not straightforward and are not simple.
How likely is it that students in the standard exam are going to come across worded problems, like hefty worded problems? Is that that's been a trend in the last few exams, right?
There's been a few doozies. There was the infamous one that was part of the common content between advanced and standard. Was the first sentence was, a cricket is an insect. And that's kind of like the dog whistle for mathematics teachers across the state, regardless of which course you teach, because you hear a cricket is an insect and it's like, oh, that question. Look, you're right, though, in suggesting that they're going to be very worded problems. That one that I'm referring to there sat on 2 A4 pages. So that the exam booklet is an A3 page that's folded, and it sat on 2 consecutive pages with some information and then a graph and some more information. And I believe there was a table, and finished with one sentence that said, calculate this. So you have a page and a half of information to go from, followed by a sentence of, now do this. So if you broke that down into 5, that was a 5-mark question. If you broke that down into 5 single marks, really not that hard. Use this to find this, use that answer to find this. It's not terribly difficult. But the idea of being able to take all this information, process it, be able to leave a couple of things out and go, that's actually not relevant for me, or it's not going to be relevant here, but I have to bring it back in later. That's really critical. My suggestion is, look, these exam questions are normally not written in a way that are designed to just have bonus information to confuse you. Whilst not everything is relevant at every single step, if you're being told something in an exam question and you're not sure where to start, or if it is one of these bigger mark questions, have a think to yourself, what does that mean? Okay, so if I'm told the volume of this shape is this, what does that mean? Okay, do I know a formula for that volume? Yes, I do. How could I maybe use that? Okay, instead I was told something about the mean of this data set, but that doesn't look terribly relevant for me. Okay, what's the mean? How could I possibly draw that in some way to make a start? And those are the types of questions where you're going to be really having to unpack that written element. And if we're really honest, the standard paper is a very lengthy one in terms of its literacy capacity. So where you might look at the advanced paper and it says, do this for 3 marks, 1 sentence, 2 sentences. And that's a different level of complexity. In a standard exam, you might have a page of information to do a couple of marks. So you've got to get comfortable with that. And again, the only way you're going to get comfortable with that is by doing some practice. I wouldn't be thinking I could go do all the questions from my textbook that are minimal on the literacy component and minimal on the unpacking of information as preparation, and then walk into an exam and be able to do exam questions. You're going to have to practice how you intend to play, to use a sporting analogy.
And what I heard from you then, Ben, as well, is that sense of like those skills or those questions, as you said, aren't necessarily hard if you pull them apart. But I guess the complexity here for students is that they're sitting in exam conditions. They've got a clock clicking next to them in a sense. So what I heard from you is essentially when you come across those questions, don't panic. Just start to vary, as you described there, very methodically start to just pull it apart and make links to the syllabus in terms of where it's relevant, because that's really where you're going to say, okay, well, what is this asking me to do? I know these things in the syllabus, bring that in. And that, I think, that's the challenge sometimes when you're sitting in exam conditions. You just see that 1.5 pages and go, wow, like, what is this asking me to do? So I think your advice there in just terms of like methodically working through it, I think is useful for students, especially those that are really going to want to tackle those and go for a band 5 or 6.
Definitely. And you've always got your reference sheet available to you as well that you can go and have a look at. All right, is there a formula I've forgotten? Is there a different way to present this formula? They're the types of things where you might just get a little memory jogger. I would often suggest to students what you'll be given in your examination is that reference sheet, and obviously that's going to be the standard version that you can see and is publicly available. But having your own little annotations on that reference sheet to tell you what each thing represents, what you could use it for, what's got to input into different formulae or different scenarios where you could use something is not a bad idea as well. And perhaps even looking at that reference sheet without those annotations and saying, okay, what did I know about that formula? Okay, I'm not told which formula is the volume of a cone and which one's the volume of a sphere, but how did I pick them apart? What did I have on my annotated one that told me, oh, I remember what I had. That's the thing that can jog that memory for me. And if you're really running aground on a question and saying, I don't know what to do here, there is always the option to leave it and come back. It does not have to be a linear journey from question 16 to question 41. You can jump about if you need to. You might do the first 10 written questions and then I've come into a couple that are a little bit more challenging. I'll leave those and I'll come back to them later on. You might want to start with the written questions. I always actually like to sort of start by writing some maths, as opposed to doing a multiple choice question that are very binary. I make a little mistake on that multiple choice question, 0 out of 1. Make a little mistake on a 3-mark written question, I might be 2 out of 3, and I can pick up that mistake when I do a check later on. Yeah, that might be something you choose to do. Or not. Maybe you just love doing the multiple choice first because I can get in there and knock those off, and then that's one big chunk of my paper done. But have a strategy, but also have some flexibility to say, oh, that section's a little bit harder than I thought. Be willing to adjust.
And as long as students allow that time and do that thorough check to go back through and say, oh, that's right, I didn't do question 7, better just like pick that up now in, the last 20 minutes or whatever. I think as long as they've got that plan, as you said, the strategy for the game day. Any other tips or advice for the actual exam day now that we're talking about it, particularly around just anything that you've seen in terms of handwriting, writing outside of margin, using the calculator, anything that you see where students just make, I guess, what could be called kind of just silly mistakes that, they could easily avoid, which aren't even related sometimes to maths?
Yeah, definitely. So a couple of things there. Please make sure you have a calculator that works. Please make sure you have a calculator that has a fully functioning battery and is very much charged and ready to go for the day. I would hate to hear of a student wandering in and having their calculator start to play silly on them during that exam. Even if it means you're bringing in a spare, borrow one from a sibling if they're doing something, or someone who's not doing a maths paper on that day, and you might be able to have a spare calculator available to you. Never a bad idea. Speaking along that lines, we only use degrees in the standard course, so I'm sure you have thought about this when you're doing trigonometry. Please make sure there is a small letter D for degrees at the top of your screen, whichever model you are using, instead of an R for radians or a G for gradient. We want that to be in D for degrees, because otherwise all your answers that you do for trigonometry will not make sense. The calculations themselves might be right, but the answers will not be. In terms of the actual presentation of your exam, you've been hearing this for about 5.5 years now. You've got to show you're working. There are marks awarded for working. There will be situations where a bold answer or just a number without any supporting reasoning might be accepted, but there'll be lots where the working is actually being judged just as much as the solution itself. The other thing to take into account is that you've got to present your answers in a way that are really clear and succinct and are answering a question. So if the question says, I think of one from 2 years ago with a year 12 class that I had, how many koalas would you expect to weigh over a certain amount? Well, then your final answer should be 15 koalas or 23 koalas, whatever number you land on based on the working that you've done, and finish with that nice boxed answer to show here is exactly what I think the answer is, so that whoever's marking this can sequentially see where you've landed there. So your paper will be scanned. They're not physically marked, they are digitally marked. So please make sure that you're using a nice strong pen as you are writing that. If you draw a graph in pencil because you've been well trained to do so and can rub that out if you need to make an amendment to that, please make sure that that's a really thick pencil, or even go over it in pen to make sure that when it's scanned, it's actually picked up. You'll see as well on the margins of your paper, there's like a slicing point, you see there's a dotted line that's left there that as to where it's going to be sliced. So don't write in that section, but it's made very clear to you for that one. And make sure you answer all 15 multiple choice questions. Some really basic things there that even if you get to the last 40 seconds and, oh no, I meant to come back to question 14 and 15 that were really hard, I'm not sure. Quick flick to the question. All right, I know it's not A or B. I'm picking one of C or D. You will get 0 if you do not attempt. If you get it wrong, you will also get 0 at no cost. So just make sure you've got 15 really clear answers there for your multiple choice section as well. If you have absolutely no idea how to do a question and you come back to it, you could consider writing down a formula. You can consider writing down some information, but just rewriting the question is not really going to be adding too much value. Try to be writing down something that you think could be adding value or earning you some marks. If you really are just in those last 5 or 10 minutes and you go, I've got no idea. I don't know where to go with this one.
Great practical advice, Ben. You've shared a lot today that I think for students listening, it's going to be really useful in terms of structuring their revision, but then also just preparing and performing on exam day. So appreciate your time again.
Thank you. No, not at all. Yeah, I love the standard course. I think it's great. And it is one that really can reward students who are willing to work hard, because there's only so many ways you can be asked to do certain things. As much as some of the things we've talked about here do lead themselves to complicated questions that need to be unpacked, there's only so many ways you can be asked to do the things that are in this course. So if you have been putting in the work for this year and for the last 18 months in this course, and you continue to do so all the way up until the middle of October there, it's one that can be really rewarding.
Lovely to chat to you, Ben.
Thanks so much, Clinton.